Right, good morning everybody. A very warm welcome to this meeting of the Communities Overview Committee. I'm Councillor Cecilia Motley, Chair of the Committee. I'm going to put my video on, but I have rather poor quality unfortunately this morning, so I may have to take myself off. I'm obliged to inform you that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded. Members of the public will be able to hear the audio of the meeting and view the papers shown on the screen. The meeting is being held using remote technology, and should any committee member experience technical difficulties during the meeting, they should immediately contact the designated IT officer on the number they've already been supplied with. Everyone is requested to mute their microphones unless asked to speak. Please only use the chat function to indicate the desire to speak. Do not use it for anything else, so that it is clear who is asking to talk. The debate has to be heard by those listening to the audio feed. As Chair, I will interpret the Council's existing standing orders in light of the requirements of remote participation, with advice from the monitoring officer prior to making a ruling. I will ask members of the committee to confirm their presence and any disclosable pecuniary interest they have in any of the items on the agenda. I will ask everyone that speaks during the meeting, including members of the committee and officers, to introduce themselves each time they speak. This is so those listening know who is speaking. I shall now turn to the items on the agenda. Item 1, apologies. Can the committee officer confirm if there are any apologies and substitutions, please?
Thank you. I understand we've had apologies from Councillor Winwood and Councillor Elliott Lynch is substituting.
Right, thank you very much for that, Emily, and a warm welcome to Councillor Elliott Lynch joining us this morning. Item 2, roll call and disclosable pecuniary interests. I would just like to remind members to disclose any pecuniary interest in any matters to be discussed which is not included in the register of interests, and leave the meeting prior to the matter being discussed. That is, turn off your video, turn off your audio, and physically leave if you can. I will now read out each member's name and ask them to confirm their presence and confirm if they have any interests. I'm Councillor Cecilia Motley and I'm Chair of the meeting. Councillor Nick Hignett. You're muted, Nick.
Sorry about that. Present and no pecuniary interests.
Thank you. Councillor Claire Aspinall. Councillor Claire Aspinall. Not present, I think. If you could note that, Emily, please. Councillor Ted Clark. Councillor Ted Clark. He certainly was here. I might come back to him. He's probably having difficulty getting on. Councillor Nigel Hartin.
Yes, here, Chair, and no pecuniary interests that I'm aware of to declare.
Thank you very much. Councillor Roger Hughes.
Present, no interest.
Thank you. Councillor Viv Parry.
Yes, I'm present, no interest.
Thank you. Councillor Keith Roberts.
Present, no interest, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Leslie Winwood, we've already covered. He is unable to attend, and Elliott Lynch is in his place. Councillor Elliott Lynch, do you have any pecuniary interest in the meeting? Any item?
Present, Chair, and no pecuniary interest on any items.
Thank you very much. Councillor Tina Woodward.
Present and no pecuniary interests.
Thank you all very much. Right, moving on to the minutes of the meeting held on the 28th of October. I move that the minutes of the Communities Overview Committee meeting held on 28th of October 2020 as circulated be signed as a correct record. Could I have a seconder, please?
Tina Woodward, I'll settle that, second that, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Tina. I will now accept these minutes as a true record unless anyone else indicates differently. Everybody happy with the minutes? Right, thank you very much indeed. Right, we move on to item 4, public question time. One question has been received from Mr. Edward Tate. Committee officer, I'd be grateful if you could read the question and the response to the question, please.
Hello, Chair. Yeah, just bear with me a moment, please. Chair, just forgive me a moment. I seem to have misplaced the question. Okay, Chair, sorry about that. Okay, here's the question. Agenda item 6 is about the 2020 floods. The additional document for this agenda item is Appendix 1, River Severn Partnership. That document is dated 27th of September 2020, although it was presented at the Cabinet meeting on the 7th of September 2020. At paragraph 5.3 on page 5, the report referred to an Appendix B with information that outlines the wider scale of opportunities from progressing a holistic package of flood alleviation and infrastructure investment measures. The report went on to list some of these claimed benefits, but the detail of those figures is not set out in the stated Appendix B. That Appendix B document itself is Unlocking the Opportunities for the 7th Growth Zone, supplementary report to the River Severn Partnership, July 2020. On page 6 of that report, it says that in the appendices you will find the detailed data that we have used to build up the set of assumptions set out in the investment pitch. But the report does not include those appendices, which are shown on the contents page beginning at page 20. As Shropshire Council presumably referred to those sub-appendices in quoting some or all of the figures in the additional document for this agenda item 6, can you please supply me copies of those appendices to Unlocking the Opportunities for the 7 Growth Zone supplementary report to the River Severn Partnership, July 2020, and also make them available to the general public? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Do you have a response?
Chair, it's Steve Smith, the Assistant Director for Infrastructure, and I'd like to respond to that.
Thank you, Steve.
Apologies that the appendix wasn't attached to that report. It's a report that isn't a Shropshire Council report, but a River Severn Partnership report. So I've asked for a copy of that report, which coincidentally has just arrived in my inbox. So I'll make sure that they're available as part of the minutes for this meeting.
Thank you, Steve. Daniel, can you advise, please, as committee officer, whether supplementaries are appropriate or not?
That's to your discretion, Chair.
I'm not sure if we have the questioner with us at the moment.
I'm not aware that we do, Chair.
No, okay. In which case, I think if Steve, you could be kind and send the response to him, that would be very helpful.
I will.
Thank you. Member question time. Do we have questions from members? Daniel?
Chair, I'm aware of no questions from members.
Thank you very much. Okay. Right, now let's get on to the substantive meeting. Item 6. And we have, I think, in attendance for this item, Dave Edwards, Environment Agency Partnership and Strategic Overview Team Leader. Dave, are you with us?
I certainly am. Morning.
Good.
All.
Well, welcome. It's nice to have you with us again.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Right. I believe Steve Smith, you're going to introduce this item. Am I right?
I am, Chair.
Thank you very much.
So again, Steve Smith, the Assistant Director for Infrastructure. So thank you for the opportunity to present the work that we did at the beginning of this year. So the report provides an overview of the flooding that took place throughout Shropshire in February. and how we managed that response, not just Shropshire Council, but in liaison with some of our partners. It's fair to say that I think the council and our partners were commended by many of those affected and by some of the key partners. But as ever, there's opportunities for learning, and we've examined our response and have suggested some recommendations in our report to strengthen Shropshire's readiness for any future flooding. The impact of the flooding was significant and was not just cited in one area, it was across the county. And the cost of managing that response during the crisis was over £500,000 to the council. And the capital cost for the council to undertake sort of unavoidable repairs as a result was at least £2.74 million. Although the underlying damage that flooding caused to highways, bridges, drainage and other infrastructure is still being discovered. A lot of highways have been quite damaged, and subsoil has been washed away. So we're still finding areas of highway network that needs repair. So that 2.74 million is really a quite conservative estimate. And of all that, the council was only able to recover £60,000 from grant funding. It's fair to say that flooding doesn't necessarily come too unexpected. There is opportunities to prepare for flooding. So the council do have emergency flood plans in place, and we were able to enact during the flooding times. In this occasion, there'd been a significant amount of rain in the preceding months, and we'd experienced the wettest June to October on record, and this was followed by the wettest February on record. So we had a situation where we had ground completely saturated with nowhere for further waters to go to. And this led to a significant event on both the 8th and 15th of February, when we had the twin impacts of Storm Ciara and Storm Dennis, which saw record flood river levels in several areas of the county, including in Shrewsbury and in Ludlow. And it's fair to say that because of that sort of lack of anywhere for the floodwaters to go into the groundwater, the speed and severity of the flooding was unprecedented for the county. This made modelling for the Environment Agency quite challenging to understand what was going to happen, because it was happening so quickly, and also meant that us being able to, as a multi-agency response, being able to plan effectively was quite challenging. Certainly putting strain on many resources and meaning extra activity being taken place during that time. There were several rollout of established flood defences that were in place across the county, and this was able to prevent quite a lot of flooding in the county. But unfortunately, there were plenty of places that didn't have flood measures that did flood, particularly in Shrewsbury, Bridgnorth and Ludlow, where we saw probably the most extensive property flooding, but also a lot of villages and communities where flooding did occur, and in many cases for the first time. So areas where we wouldn't necessarily have expected flooding to occur were being flooded. So in reaction to that, on the 16th of February, the multi-agency tactical coordinating group was set up to really make sure that it wasn't just isolated approaches. It was a one team multi-agency approach to managing the situation. And this was in place for 2 weeks, and set up rest centres and new community emergency plans, and brought in other agencies such as the British Red Cross to support us. What the tactical coordinating group did was mean we was able to coordinate activities. So we coordinated rescues, evacuations, welfare checks, an ongoing support activity. That initial coordinating group was meant that it continued to have officers collaborating to make sure that support was ongoing going forward. As a council, we also set up community engagement teams to support the worst affected areas, contacting flooded residents and businesses to ensure that they had access to support. And this helped us be able to get better communications out, but also to better understand what was happening on the ground, so we was able to react in a more intelligent way. Unfortunately, being late February and just prior to COVID, part of that community engagement was impacted by COVID as we got into the lockdown and had to put in social distancing measures, and not really knowing what COVID meant at that time, it did put a delay in us being able to engage at times with some of the flooding communities, and also to investigate some of the causes of the flooding. And for us, it's really important to get in there as soon as possible to better understand what was actually happening, to know what the causes were. The council also trialled a pilot project with the National Flood Forum, who provided virtual support on online platforms with flooded residents and other relevant authorities. And they've continued to engage and support various communities across the county, with resulting in several flood action groups being set up. The flood action groups are really there to help provide more localised resilience and strategies that can feed into our own, or feed in and complement our own supports. DEFRA also provided a flood support grant, and this was distributed across eligible businesses to contribute towards the direct and indirect costs of flooding, so loss of sales and any damage that wasn't able to be recovered elsewhere. And for that, we had 556 applications, of which 526 were approved. We also, as part of our response, increased our ability for customers to contact us. So our customer services team was increased, and the contact hours extended, so that they were operating till about 9 at night, so that the customers could contact us. And we also had out of hours availability as well. So there was a contracted arrangement that meant that people could still contact the council out of the hours the customer service centre was operating, and calls be directed to duty officers to be able to respond. It's fair to say that at times that whole area was completely saturated with calls on flooding, and it meant that very little else was able to be addressed by that customer service team, while they were directing where the most urgent needs were. And particularly where we received several complaints after the fact was that out of hours provision, where the provision was people were able to contact the council, but it was to all intents and purposes just forwarding it to the highways duty officer, and therefore the highways duty officer was split between being able to enable action to be taken whilst also trying to make calls back to residents to find out where the issues were, and that certainly during overnight periods was causing a lot of frustration with long delays of people being able to contact the council. As I said earlier, there's the impact of the flooding was over about 3 weeks, but it's been continuing. So there's been a lot of people who are still not able to, are still suffering with the impact of the flooding, both within their houses and in businesses, and the highway network is still really suffering. And we've seen almost 4 times the amount of damage to the highway network than we previously experienced, and we've got a long backlog of potholes and things that are creating quite an ongoing pressure within the highways teams to continue fixing these. And one of the biggest impacts we've seen is in the drainage systems themselves, which, it's fair to say, over the last few years, maintenance has been reduced to reflect the budgetary positions, while still being operative and fit for purpose during normal times. What we have found is, because of the amount of floodwaters that did come through and the extra silt and debris that's been put into those systems, we now have several drainage systems across the county which are blocked or at least significantly reduced the capacity. So we've undertaken a huge amount of work since then to be able to go around and clean and repair some of those damaged drainage systems so that they're fit for purpose should we have another event in over this winter. And that's taken a huge drain of additional resource and funding to be able to deliver that. And as I said earlier, all of those costs fall outside of the Bellwyn funding, and that's put a real pressure onto our budgets. I mean, one of the what I should emphasise is this wasn't any one area, and therefore within the report we've provided a map of those areas that were affected, and you can see that it really is multiple areas of impact across the whole county that has really meant that the level of support and provision that we need to provide to those areas impacted has been significant. There's a lot of unsung heroes that went as part of this. I think a lot of recognition was given to those directly engaging with communities and supporting the floods, but there was a lot of activity going in the background, and a lot of staff were diverted from their day jobs to help support not just the flooding event, but also to backfill some of those essential services to enable others to support. And things like our transport services provided an awful lot of support to help evacuation and make sure that key transport for people who needed to get to school, get to work, was still available throughout the flooding crisis. There was a lot of support provided to businesses both during and after as well, with regular engagement from our economic growth teams to identify what support was available, and we got a lot of support through the various bids within the county and town councils to enable, again, that it was a one-stop shop of support rather than organisations providing that. Sorry, I've got a bit of a freeze on my I'm suffering from the dreaded freezes again. So I suppose in summary, what I'd like to say is that we've got an identified amount of recommendations where we feel that whilst things did work well, there were things we could do better and prepare ourselves for the future. So the summary of those recommendations is that whilst we did have an emergency plan in place, actually what we didn't have was a specific plan for severe weather. And one of the things we're looking to what we'd like to begin developing now is a council-wide severe weather plan, because things worked well. It wasn't just a highways response or anything. It was a sort of a combined response, and it worked well. And I think what we could do with is a severe weather plan to make sure that we are fit for purpose specifically for flooding or similar events in future, and that this should include what almost a duty officer process, that when we know we've got forward advance of these floodings, we're proactive in identifying the resources we're likely to need to bring that into the system, including perhaps supporting that communications during out of hours events, so that we're not splitting time between officers needing to manage contact and delivering sort of results and meaningful actions for the council. One of the other challenges we've had is the new grant that came in to support the support businesses. Being a new grant, it wasn't quite clear where something like that would sit, and therefore it sat with our flood manager, and again meant that we were drawing a specialist resource who was looking into investigating the causes and recommendations for future changes to flooding, but also utilising him to manage part of this flood grant distribution. And I think we could have learned from that and managed the distribution of that in a different way that would have meant we weren't splitting resource. And finally, the work we did with the National Flood Forum, whilst a pilot, proved sort of extremely useful, not just for the council, but for those engaged. And as I said, we've had several flood forums and flood action groups set up as a result, which the National Flood Forum is continuing to resource. That was set up as a one-off, and our thanks go to the Environment Agency, who helped fund the support of the Flood Forum in that. But it's something that if we want to make sure that we're better prepared going forward, I think that we could work with by funding the National Flood Forum ourselves, probably jointly with Telford, who I know are also interested in doing so, to make sure that we're enabling our communities to be more self-resilient and engage more effectively with other authorities that are managing flood risk. So that's the summary of my report.
Thank you, Steve, and I would like to congratulate you on honestly an extremely vivid and clear report, and one which was very much no holds barred in terms of what went well and what didn't go well. And I do think that this morning we really need to go over those areas which you've identified yourselves, both in the report and you just now, Steve, with regard to how we can do better next time. I'm very conscious of the fact, reading through this report, that a huge amount of responsibility devolved onto the shoulders of relatively few officers and multi-agency support in a very short time, because of course when a flood happens, it's not as if you have much time to prepare. And as a result of that, it was quite obvious from your report that an awful lot of people were working very long hours in order to keep the show on the road, as it were. And I think we have to express our sincere thanks to them for all the efforts that they've put in. And of course, I had forgotten myself that COVID then suddenly hit, and there you were having to social distance while still having to work probably extremely long hours. So I think I need to start by thanking officers for such a candid report. And we need now, I think, to go through how we can recommend that we do better next time. Particularly in regard, I think, to resources, and I don't mean necessarily financial resources, although I think there is certainly a place for those. But I think also whether we were happy with the multi-agency joined up response, because obviously I can imagine that you were working with the fire service, you must have been working with the police, obviously the Environment Agency, and that also we need to be aware of how Shropshire Council itself can actually flex to respond very quickly to very difficult situations. And it seems to me that we do have a certain experience of doing that now with COVID through the community reassurance teams. And we might just have a look at, as the discussion goes forward, whether we could use that kind of a model to actually set up a sort of a responsive service in times of severe weather. So there's a lot to go at here. Having said that, I don't want to keep everybody here all morning. So I would actually like, if we can, to draw this meeting to a close as near 12 o'clock as we can. So now I'm going to open this up to members to ask questions. And please, Steve, feel free to invite any of your officers or anybody you see fit to respond to any particular questions. Right, members, over to you now. On the chat function, please. Go, go, go. And I've frozen. No.
Chair, David Turner has a question for you.
Oh yes, David Turner, and I have very kindly allowed to join the meeting, as he was particularly concerned about an issue in Much Wenlock. So, Councillor Turner, would you like to join us, please?
Poised and ready, but muted. Sorry. Thank you, Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I'll endeavour to contain my comments to allow you to finish at 12 o'clock, and maybe one or two other people to speak as well. First of all, may I pay tribute also to those Shropshire Council staff that responded to the storm events referred to in this paper. They and many local residents worked hard to ensure that those affected were assisted in dealing with flooding. Whilst the focus of this paper appears to be on river flooding, I welcome it, and I'm pleased to read that surface water flooding has been mentioned. It doesn't matter where the water comes from, whether it be from a river that's burst its banks or from the street because the drains can't cope. If your carpets are floating, the emotional and financial costs are usually the same. At the Cabinet meeting on the 7th of September, in the context of the River Severn Partnership Shropshire Flood Prevention agenda item, the leader provided assurance to me that a full assessment of needs associated with surface water flooding is being prepared and will be brought forward as part of either a strategy for the River Severn catchment or the Council's own highway and drainage capital programme. Would the committee please ensure that there is focus on the less newsworthy but nonetheless distressing surface water flood impacts? That's my first question. The paper refers at 5.7 to reduce levels of maintenance of the highways, gullies and connecting drain systems. The network was not as resilient as it could have been. Coincidentally, and locally, Much Wenlock Town Council only yesterday reported concerns about fallen leaves, silt and general detritus blocking drains. And it will not be unique to Much Wenlock that during the harvest the roads were strewn with straw, which all ends up in our drainage systems. Will a better regime of highways cleansing be introduced to avoid the problems of debris blocking the drains? Shropshire Council's Highways and Transport submitted a local authority maintenance challenge fund bid expression of interest to the Department of Transport in October 2019. This focused on the communities of Albrighton, Clun, Shifnal and Much Wenlock to improve physical drainage infrastructure to deal with the changing impact of flooding in these areas. This is a substantial bid, of which I think the DFT provided £2.6 million, and I believe that £400,000 is coming from Shropshire Highways, giving a total of just over £3 million. When will the local authority maintenance challenge funds monies be implemented? Also in 5.7, I note the reference to the reduction in ditch maintenance and grip cutting that's had a more prominent detrimental effect in rural areas. At times, some lanes are impassable due to standing water, often due to a lack of maintenance. And the blame for this cannot always be laid directly at the council's door, but its reduced resources and consequent inability to pursue landowners to deal with land drainage makes travel difficult for those living in rural settlements. What steps are being taken to address rural highway flooding? And finally, at 2.1, the report puts the recommendation that Shropshire Council develops a severe weather plan to consolidate its preparation across all departments for future extreme weather events. At the Place Overview Committee held in July 2018, I asked questions about the Highways Winter Maintenance Plan with reference to the volunteer snow wardens. I appreciate this may not be germane to this agenda item, but it warrants consideration with it. I won't go into detail here, but can the broader local community response to weather events be an holistic approach? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Turner. That is quite a substantial tranche of questions. I suspect quite a lot of these are going to come up as we go along. The issue of standing water and surface water impact, I think, is a very serious one, both in the towns and also in the rural areas. I think on the whole, we recognise the fact that the Highways Department has suffered from severely reduced budgets over the years. I think one of the things that we need to look at is how and whether we can actually give more money to highways to deal particularly with prevention work, because by the time flooding or standing water happens, it's always too late, isn't it? So I think that's one important issue which I'm hoping we will develop as we go along. The DFT bid is an interesting one. Can anybody cover that, Steve?
Yes, I can cover that. As you'll appreciate, it's not just the four sites that Councillor Turner referred to with the DFT bid, but quite substantial areas of remedial and improvement works to make sure that we're looking across the whole of the county to improve the situation. So it's fair to say that we've got limited drainage resource, both with ourselves and WSP, our consultants, who are. This wasn't just a Shropshire event; it was pretty much an event across this whole region, and therefore their resources are stretched too. Notwithstanding that, we're working with WSP to develop all of those schemes, and we're intending to roll them out during the summer of next year. And again, these are sort of things that you really want to try and aim to get them done when the drainage systems aren't full, and therefore you want to aim for those drier summer months. If I can just sort of reassure that as an authority and indeed as part of the River Severn Partnership, we are looking at not just fluvial flooding from the rivers, but also surface water and groundwater flooding. So the approach to flooding is a comprehensive approach, not just focusing on the rivers in the county. And also with regards to improvements on the maintenance side of things, one of the other initiatives that we've set up since is trialling an in-house gang to support us on some of the more detailed and tricky maintenance issues within the county, to complement the work that we get from Kier. So we try to add resources into that proactive maintenance to try and get on top of the significant amount of blockage and flooding, the standing water flooding that we're seeing across the county, and they're working their way around the county. And I'd like to think that it's an area where we're receiving a lot of plaudits because of they're going in and really looking at some of the historic issues that have arisen there that perhaps we haven't had the opportunity to address in the past.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that. Are you all right with that, Mr. Turner?
Yes, I think I am. I remain concerned about debris in the highway, which there seems to be some difficulty, unless it's actually a traffic hazard, in clearing away. Say particularly during the harvest. I don't know what the answer is. Clearly, farmers ought to secure their load rather better than maybe they do, but we get stuff washing out of fields as well. So I don't know whether there's a bit of a charm offensive with the NFU required in that respect, but thank you otherwise.
Thank you for that. Just one suggestion, actually, because funnily enough, I was just thinking about this issue of field runoff, which contributes hugely to problems on roads and lanes. I'm wondering, actually, Steve, if there is any way in which we can connect better with the farming community to try and persuade them. And in fact, it may not be us who has to do this in the end. It may well be whatever new arrangements farmers have to live with under the new Brexit regime. But it does seem to me that if we could have more remedial work going on with the farming community, it might just help the general effort. I wonder if you could just quickly comment on that, perhaps. Or it might be Dave Edwards might like to have a think about that.
Well, I'm certainly happy to respond on that point. You're absolutely right. Part of the causes that happen for flooding can be the runoff from fields, and certainly the way in which sometimes fields are ploughed can accelerate the way water comes into the water system. So there is a part to play on how we manage our land, and it's not just farmers, it's all sort of larger landholders have a bit of a responsibility on how we can manage this. So as part of the River Severn Partnership, certainly one of the things we are doing is seeing how we can better work with the larger landowners to help mitigate some of the problems that you refer to there.
Good, thank you very much for that. Now, I'm sorry, I've hogged the floor quite enough now. Nick Hignett, please.
Thank you, Chair. I thank Steve Smith for his report. I will keep my comments just to a couple of points because, as with many other wards, Lay Valley Ward was affected by flooding. I know that the smaller events were mentioned in the report, and I would urge officers to, as well as dealing with the bigger flooding events, to bear in mind the parish councils and I presume to a certain extent town councils as well. They are the ones right at the forefront of flooding events. We're usually the first to know. And in my particular case, a lot of the residents that were affected were very elderly residents. So it's nice to see that there is a plan to help try and clear some of the drainage ditches and areas in the summer. My main question really is about the severe weather plan that's being drawn up to include creation of flood action groups. Particularly in one village, Minsterley, we've had a flood action group for about 20 to 25 years now. The flooding events are not first time events, and in February it was as bad as it's ever been. The funding for this, which is through the National Flood Forum, mentions the creation of flood action groups across Shropshire. I'd just like to emphasise that the flood action groups that are already up and running, and in conjunction with the parish councils, they're the ones that probably have the local knowledge and suggestions as to what can be done. So I'd like to just check that the funding will get down to these smaller flood action groups as well, so that they can provide the valuable information that is needed if we're going to move forward and try and prevent flooding events. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's a very good point, which if you hadn't raised, I think I would have done anyway, because it does seem to me that we need to get down very much to the details of when thinking about community response. It's not just the flood action groups that are already in existence. It's encouraging more flood action groups to set up. It's also, I think, about making sure that the unitary councillors are brought into the loop as well, because sometimes we get slightly left out here, and we do have very strong local connections, as you would expect. But in terms of funding for flood action groups, do we know whether there is a steady flow of funding for flood action groups, or are they largely left to their own devices? Could anybody assist me with that one, please?
I'm happy to respond to that one, Chair.
Thank you, Steve.
So Steve Smith, Assistant Director again. In the most part, the flood action groups are voluntary groups, and therefore there's very limited funding that they draw upon. Where I've experienced them working best is where they are affiliated with the National Flood Forum and actually get engaged with the various multiple agencies. So I can give an example of when I was in Oxfordshire of how we worked with the National Flood Forum to provide training with the Fire Service, Environment Agency, waste collection teams, so that when they were going into rivers and pulling stuff out, it was able to be disposed of. So it was enabling those flood forums or flood action groups to draw off resources that were already available to them in an effective way, and in some part providing some of the tools and equipment that was needed in that as well. So it's not necessarily about the funding, but it's about how we can enable those flood action groups to work more effectively.
Yeah, that's helpful. And is that actually happening at the moment, Steve, or is this something we need to initiate rather more?
It's something that we need to initiate rather more. As I said in the report, the National Flood Forum was something that we trialled and working with more closely at the beginning of this year. We did do a lot of work with National Flood Forum in the past, but with very few flood action groups that it was supporting. What we're seeing now is a quick rise in those flood action groups that I think with the help and the support of the National Flood Forum can become really useful, meaningful assets to communities and a resource to the council to have a better intelligence in flooding, so that we're better prepared to react going forward.
And are the new flood act, probably the well-established flood action groups, know all about the National Flood Forum, but do you think the new groups that have sprung up are coming within the fold or not?
Absolutely, nearly all of them are becoming affiliated with the National Flood Forum, and I was on a meeting with many of the action groups and the National Flood Forum just a few weeks ago, and there seems to be a real appreciation of the benefit the National Flood Forum are providing those groups.
Oh, that's great, because it is very reassuring, I think, for them, because I have a number of flood action groups in my own division, so I know a little bit about them, that it is very reassuring for them if they know that they have some, if there is a body that they can actually liaise with, get advice from, etc., etc. So I'm pleased to hear that. Thank you for that. Moving on, Nigel Hartin.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, referring back to Councillor David Turner, he made some excellent points, as David often does, in relation to, particularly in relation to 5.7 on the report. I think something which could be repeated right the way across the county. I do worry, and it's something that you refer to, Cecilia, in terms of the budget that we have in place in terms of being able to respond. I do begin to worry that we have, well, I've wrote for a little while, that we have reduced our budget in highways too far in the cuts that we've made in recent years, and that's something that perhaps we should look at again. But on a local basis, I do know that divisional surveyors, roads inspectors work extremely hard with the budgets that they have got in order to try and deal with the issues that crop up all of the time. And certainly here down in the south of the county, we do have quite a lot of joint working, if you like, with the local farming community to assist as required. But I think that could also be potentially looked at as a means of improving through the NFU. Coming back to the input of others onto the field, I think the input of the Environment Agency is very important. I think certainly the local residents are always very concerned about, for instance, dredging and so on, and clearing out dredging at bridges and so on. And the input we've had here down in the south from the Environment Agency has been very, very helpful over the most recent months. Indeed, just before the lockdown, we had the Environment Agency both in Clonard and in Button in my division doing tours around looking at what could be done to improve the situation within the rivers in the division, and that was very helpful. Indeed, I've got a Microsoft Teams meeting with Rachel Glover and others from the Environment Agency this afternoon at 3 o'clock to continue that process. I suppose my question in relation to the recommendations comes to, again, down to this, how we can tie up with what we're proposing to do in terms of creating reserve officer capacity, establishing a wider grants team, etc., with the budgets that we've currently got. I'm concerned that although we have very clear recommendations, which would be very good if we could do them, I am concerned that we have got insufficient budgets to be able to do that unless we look at them again. So I just some comment, perhaps some officers, on whether or not these are actually achievable.
Thank you for that, Nigel. Steve, would you like to comment on those points, please?
Yes, of course, Chair. What I would say is that a lot of what happened in this event was sort of unknown and for the first time. So certainly things like managing the grants that were awarded and other issues. So those were things that we almost sort of would knee-jerk reactions on how we approached them. What I'm proposing with the severe weather plan is actually we're identifying, knowing that these sort of things happen, how can we identify where are the best placed resources to deliver those functions going forward, rather than in a rather reactive manner that we took. So taking the learning from this event to make sure we're better prepared next time, and identified where responsibilities for key activities take place. With regards to some of the other activities, it's really making sure we've got people on standby to be able to provide out of hours service, and knowing where those functions that perhaps we can sort of stop doing during these periods to release staff to be on standby are available. So whilst more resource would be fantastic, I think there's a part of how do we use the existing resource in a better way during these events. And as I said earlier, a lot of times these things don't come as a surprise. That you've got some warning, so you're able to set up appropriate structures and appropriate mechanisms to make sure that you're better placed to deliver and be proactive in our approach rather than reactive.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. I mean, I think that opens a really very interesting set of questions about what sort of structure, whether we call it that or whether it's loosely defined or whether it's quite tightly defined, do we put in place to ensure that when we know that we are about to be faced with an incident, that we can actually pull in the resources that we need, not just on a multi-agency basis, because of course we have good relationships with our multi-agency partners as it is, but also how do we actually use council resources as effectively as we possibly can. And that's why I go back slightly to the model that was set up around COVID of the community reassurance teams, insofar as those teams evidently sucked in quite a lot of people who were then stood down and went back to their normal jobs as and when they could, as and when the situation became easier. Is that the sort of response that you would consider for something like a severe weather plan?
Absolutely, but I would also say that it's not just about the council's resource, and we've referred to the flood action groups and the parish and towns. It's about how we can engage more effectively with them as well, rather than learning as we go through an event like that. So certainly the formation of many of the flood action groups means we've got a broader resource we can engage with to plan better and be more proactive in our approach going forward.
Yeah, that's self-evident. Thank you for that. Viv, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
You're able to hear me. Thank you. I would like to say, because I live in the road in Teamside, I've lived here over
Ludlow.
20 years.
Ludlow, Viv, yes?
Yes, that's in Ludlow.
That's it.
The flood was worse this time than it was the time before. It came up about 2 foot higher. Now then, when it comes over the wall at the bottom of Teamside, it comes at a rush. So if I could have had some people who would have helped me block the road off, that would have been the first thing. I'm afraid I got a sign, that's all, one sign from the fire brigade who put that out on this side, but the other side of the road by McConnell's, there was nothing. One of the council people from our council came and put a sign out that he had in the back of his van, and he stood there for quite a long time stopping people. I also had to get one of my constituents to put a car in the road to stop lorries, vans, everything going up and down the road. The force of the water, if we could have got some of the people who own the houses to open the garden doors, which it needed men to do it, I couldn't do it. I asked a constituent to do it and he was nearly swept into the river when we opened one door. If we could have got police or fire brigade to do that job and open those doors, the water goes back into the river after about an hour and a half. It only stays on this side, which I call the roadside, for that length of time. Can I just say that after the event, because I talked about the event, after the event I went from house to house and gave each person a form to fill in to let me know what had happened to them, what they thought of recommendations from the council, which was needed, and how much money they'd lost, different things. Now, Chris Westwood was absolutely fantastic. He took all those forms, and my people here in Teamside got the money very quickly. But Core Street didn't do that. Core Street, there was nobody did that, and they were waiting an awful long time. If I'd have known that was going to happen, I'd have gone to every house down there as well. The main thing really is we have a flood forum here, and I found that nobody came from the flood forum to help me in any shape or form. As I keep saying, I could have done with a couple of men actually to go from house to house, going in. We couldn't go in through the doors because of the water, but just to say through the windows, are you all right? And we didn't get any sandbags till 4 o'clock in the afternoon at all. So I was up and down for 5 hours, and I must say that I was absolutely frozen by the end of it. But, you know, if you want to look after your constituents, you've got to do those sort of things. If we could coordinate what happens in Core Street, which is the other flooding part, with Teamside, and we coordinate with the flood forum, and I believe we've got a new flood forum started in Ludlow as well, new people who are going to look at all these things. I'm afraid the original flood forum didn't do really very much. They made sandwiches in the hall but nobody came to do anything to help.
Right, Viv, thank you. This sounds to me like the need for the Flood Forum to start coordinating matters very early on, so that they themselves have got, as it were, a plan for when this happens. But again, it would be helpful for them to be liaising with council representatives as well. Steve, do you want to add anything to that?
Only that, I mean, firstly, the council is liaising with that Ludlow Flood Forum, as is the National Flood Forum. But that's exactly the sort of intelligence and sort of local support that we see the benefit of a flood forum, and identifying what actions are needed and making sure that those activities are supported locally. Certainly, one of the things we identified, particularly for Ludlow, was the location of sandbags in the area, and recognising that in hindsight, locating them somewhere different would have made them more accessible and easier to distribute within the vicinity. So again, we're looking at how we can work better locally to identify some more local storage in that area.
Thank you. There's always this issue, isn't there, about how much money do you spend on getting sand and filling sandbags, you know, in the summer months, ready for the winter, and how much of a hole is that making in your budget? I think it's a very tricky one, the sandbag issue, and I don't want to go into it in any more detail. But
Steve, can I just say, if you'd have opened the garden doors, the rest of them, which was 4 houses further up the street, would have been flooded at all.
Yep.
The strength of the water is such a lot. It pushed the old lady who's 102. It pushed her sheds a foot further into her garden when we did open the doors eventually. So that is how strong.
She's just muted herself. Viv, I'm just going to comment that hindsight is a wonderful thing, and I think with a bit of luck, this is all about learning going forward, and I'm sure that is what we'll do. I'm going to go on now.
To be there as well.
Okay, thank you, Viv. Tina Woodward, could I bring you in, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I must admit, Councillor Turner raised a number of issues, being as I'm a rural councillor, Alveley and Claverley division. It raised and highlighted issues which we experience on a daily basis, and obviously the storms earlier in the year, the timeframes of those, obviously with COVID linked in, I'd like to say I do appreciate how hard officers worked, and it was the pulling together of the teams, and also in the end local businesses who supported people and others, so thank you for that. But Councillor Turner is right, and I'm pleased things are happening and that we have the gullies being cleared and that we have those vehicles available to us directly, because I think it has been a failing before. But I think it's like painting of the Forth Bridge, though I understand they no longer do that. It's a different technique now, so times move. But the number of gullies that we have and the number of ditches that aren't connected in the rural areas, and that's close to the A442, the B4176, the A454, they're right by our A routes. So that when those get compromised, our lanes network, and I'm sure Steve will understand this, in a rural area, those other lanes get absolutely hammered, and there's no other word for it, that it just costs councils a fortune, and Shropshire Council, being rural with the rural roads network, really feels it. What I would say is the report gives strengths and weaknesses, and I was pleased that there were so many strengths within the officers to actually keep the teams going, stay motivated. But I think my concern is almost the support was lacking in some ways, and that does cause me concern that we had relatively small teams working very long hours. I had always assumed that with duty officers, that when we got information through, that if you like, our communications through to our call centres and others went through to duty officers. But obviously the floods have shown weaknesses that actually we do need to cover, and the report does do that quite effectively. I think we need to know how also it's going to fit in with the government's funding as we move forward for flood defences, because, you know, Bridge North has limited, Shrewsbury has defences, but it's the whole run of the River Severn that is a problem, because if Iron Bridge fails, or is successful even, it pushes the water further down the speed, but water has a natural trajectory and it's downhill and it's going to travel where it's going to go and it's going to flood. So we need to have that all tied up, because that will affect the funding that any council has to put in the future. So it's really important that the grants are delivered in a timely way to businesses and properties, because that's the flood resilience. So I think that team definitely did a good job, but it's highlighted that it needs strengthening so that people do know what they can claim, and particularly businesses, because they were then hit and are still being hit by COVID. So this report is great, but it all comes down to the fact that we're very often left in a position, such as with the DEFRA grants that come through that we administer, that the money for officers to administer that doesn't follow. Yeah. So I think we're always joining up the dots with no money following it. And I think Nigel Harting is correct, Councillor Harting, that the recommendations are great, but it's how do we find the funding within budgets to do all of this? And I think that is the challenge. I think it's right that we look at it and do as much as we can, Chairman, to try and, you know, support our officers. So thank you very much.
Tina, thank you very much for that. That's absolutely right. And the issue of DEFRA providing money but absolutely no administrative consideration of the cost of delivery is, I'm afraid, something that is not unfamiliar with government departments. But I do agree with you that it is not at all helpful when you're dealing with a local authority which has never been absolutely swimming in money. What I'd like to do now, and I would like to thank everybody for their questions, please keep them coming. But I would just like to move now on to the lessons learned, because all this is about improving resilience, isn't it, for any future flooding incidents. And there are a number of what sounds to me like extremely sensible recommendations under item 12. For example, updating the flood barriers. That sounds like an absolutely essential, because they don't last forever, and they do need replacing from time to time, and indeed probably we need more of them. So that's one thing. And as Tina has reminded us, all these things cost money, but I think our officers seem to be devising very sensible ways of getting as much done as they can without stretching the budgets too far. One of the things I would just like to cover is the issue that Tina raised about the fact that an awful lot fell on the shoulders of very few people. And I know that this has been rather a theme for me going through this, but I do think that we do need some more formal arrangements in place, so that key officers don't find themselves having to work very, very long hours without any respite. So I think that's a real takeaway from this. And the other thing that I would like to touch on is highways related, but more about diversions and how diversions come into force, and indeed when they should come into force. Just for example, there were serious issues in Shrewsbury, but also out in the rural areas again, we did have problems there because we had heavy traffic being diverted off one of our major roads, the A49, down one of the B roads, which itself flooded, which didn't help anybody, caused really quite a lot of confusion. I'm just wondering whether we can do anything. I believe we have a representative from the police here today. I'm wondering if there is anything that we can do to try and make diversions of that nature, which inevitably have to happen quite fast, whether we can get those in place earlier, or do it differently, or certainly look at whether we're doing it in the most effective way. So I wonder if anybody could respond to me on that, please. I'm aware that Steve Smith has got network problems at the moment. So if anybody, maybe Andy Wild or maybe our police representative, could perhaps contribute there, please.
Hi, Cecilia. Yeah, I'm more than happy to sort of to pick that one up if that would be suitable. So
Thank you,
terms
Andy.
of, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it was again part of the wider sort of response that we had to coordinate when we had sort of major arterial routes affected, as well as some of the minor network. We liaised quite extensively with Highways England, and I can't speak on behalf of the police, but I know that we are now sort of working closely with HE in terms of trying to understand what that resilient network looks like in Shropshire. So when the strategic network and the Highways England network is impacted, do we have sensible diversion routes in place so we don't have our rural network impacted? Because, you know, the damage from it is quite extensive. We're not blessed with sort of arterial routes in Shropshire, so often when these what we consider to be major A roads are impacted, often traffic ends up on unsuitable areas of the network, and that damage is quite extensive. It can range, you know, from all sorts of drainage assets being impacted, but also the weight and volume of these vehicles. It's quite a difficult thing to manage. So our network coordination team obviously play a part in that, in terms of advising on HE in terms of which routes are the most suitable. But we're also looking at ways that we think we can sort of upgrade some of these diversion routes and try and get them more fit for purpose. But in terms of the actual decisions, certainly in times of flood, it's often compromised because we can't always divert onto the type of routes that we want to divert onto. And again, you know, local traffic will use the rural network to find its way through. So again, I don't know the specifics around the examples, but all I can tell you is we are working closely with Highways England. They've got a new area coordinator who we're in dialogue with, and we're trying to be more coordinated and have more meaningful discussions about what improvements can be made in these instances when the strategic network through Shropshire is compromised and we have to accommodate HE traffic.
Thank you very much for that, Andy. That's very helpful. I'm very pleased to hear that you've got a good line of communication through with Highways England. That's very helpful. Can I now move to the other issue that came up, which is the need for a customer the customer service centre and the need for a central incident desk and how that's managed. Obviously, there were an awful lot of calls, and it must have been extremely difficult to have handled all of those. As far as I'm aware, calls were received by Shropdoc and the highways officers, which of course then had to go back to customer services. So that sort of delayed matters. So a centralised incidents desk sounds like a very, very sensible solution. But I wonder, how would we go about setting that up?
I'll respond to that one, Chair.
Oh, you're back again, Steve. Well done. Yes.
Yeah. Apologies for that.
No, that's all right.
So we're already working closely with our customer service centre on what something new could look like. And part of the issue is that during times of operation of the customer service centre, they're able to take the information, log it onto council systems, and then duty officers in highways can then see what's happening and where events are happening in real time on the network through our systems. The problem with utilising the Shropdoc is it's purely almost diverting the call to those duty officers. So therefore they're taking the time not just listening and managing people's expectations and concerns on phone calls, but then also having to update the system so there's visibility. And for me, it's about making sure that we've got resource to take those calls and update the systems so that we can update we can make sure that we're using our highways duty officers more effectively. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's about being proactive in identifying that that's a resource that's needed during these events, and it isn't just necessarily during flooding events. It could be any sort of severe weather event that's available to support the customer service centre during those out of hours office times to be able to undertake that engagement with people. And in particular, the one area that we recognised that there was a weakness was that we had lots of parish councils and local councillors trying to make contact during those out of hours, who were able to provide a holistic picture, but was in the same queue as everybody else. So we're getting contact, getting in through, depending on who else was in front of them in the queue. What we're also discussing is potential for a separate line for councillors and parishes, so that we can get that sort of information that perhaps has got a broader intelligence to it, and sometimes solutions that they can make available to us, so that we can fast track those sort of contacts into the centre.
Yeah, thank you. I think that sounds very sensible, actually, because it is very frustrating if you're a parish council and you can see the water flowing past, and you know that there are people potentially being badly affected by it, and you can't get through to anybody. That really does light the blue touch paper somewhat. Viv says, can I just feed in what Viv Paris just sent something through to say we needed signs before the water came over the wall from police or highways at both ends. I could not get through to customer services till 10 AM. Well, I think that explains why. Viv, can we just quickly look at the other point that was raised about processing grant applications, and the fact that an awful lot of it seemed to devolve on the shoulders of one of the busiest people on the council. And I think it's a case of how do we stop that happening again? It's the same question, it's the same problem, isn't it, that we've been talking about before, is that we've got to have people who are able to switch quickly on to doing that, so that it doesn't all have to be done by our extremely valuable drainage and flood risk manager.
Absolutely, it's one of those that, as a council, it comes in as a flooding or drainage grant, and therefore automatically by default goes to the flooding and drainage manager. And I think it's now that we're aware of the sort of grants that may come in during these events, being proactive in identifying where's a more appropriate resource to administer that. That doesn't detract from the urgent work that those technical staff do need to be doing.
Yeah, I think that would be a great relief all round, don't you? And it would also speed up delivery, hopefully. So that's very good. What else have we got here? Grant provision. I think we've more or less covered that. And also, of course, one of the most important things is communication, isn't it? In terms of having very good lines out to our comms team, and very good lines out from them to the local press, so that they can actually report in a very, very speedily on developments, so that hopefully that will stop people ploughing through chest-high water. And persuade them, perhaps better than we can, to take a diversionary route. So that's an important one. Do we have Maria Jones here? Does she want to say anything about that? No, obviously not.
I don't think Maria's with us today, Chair.
She's not. Okay, that's fine. Okay, now I've got a couple more people wanting to speak. David Turner, I'm allowing you as a special privilege to have another question.
I'm in your debt, Councillor Motley. Thank you very much, Chair. On the issue of grants, yes, I certainly back in following the February event, I was struck by the willingness of one of my octogenarian residents who'd had water all through the ground floor of her house, pointing her neighbours in the direction of the grant funding that was available, yet was unable, without my repeated intervention, to get anything for herself. And I did have to get hold of the flood manager in an effort to try and do something about the probably wrong term of words, the log jam. It was plainly an issue for the finance team, but it really was quite a struggle. And given that of the dozen or more properties that were flooded in Much Wenlock, the overwhelming majority of people who were flooded were elderly, and some of them really quite challenged in trying to make any headway with the trauma of the impact of flooding, and also the difficulty in trying to access grant funding. So if I can just urge that a rather more receptive public face, or perception of receptive public face, would be welcome. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. I think we do, as a result of this report, I think we have a much better understanding of the need for a receptive public face now. And an awful lot of this is about reassuring people who have been affected. And actually, there is just one issue that I'd like to go back to before I go to Tina Woodward, who'd like to have a word. And that's the thing about reception centres rather than rest centres. Because obviously there was a wasted resource there because of the rest centres which were opened up did not have use. They didn't have visitors. What we obviously need to do is organise it much more on a kind of information and support basis, rather than perhaps a rather more passive, if you've been flooded out, you can go there type approach. So I do think that is something to take away from there. Would anybody like to comment on that? Steve? Or are you out of action again?
No, I'm here. I'm afraid I'm unable to comment. As you'd appreciate, I only started in Shropshire after the event, so I'm not familiar with what happened at the time with those. All
right, but I mean, I think this is a point well made in this report, and I think it's one which I would like not to be lost. Just say that. Tina, would you like to speak, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. What I would say is obviously customer service advisors, it says in the report, lost sight of the grants process. They didn't have access when it was out of their control, so to speak. And it says here, some were desperate for news. Methodologies developed as a result of COVID-19 will help avoid this in the future. I'd like to know how those methodologies are working and what's being put in place. Because to me, we have computerised systems that people should be covered to have access to, cleared to have access, that to me sometimes fails. And also my bugbear is customer first and my Shropshire. So I think they're all linked on how we tie the systems together, with people coming in at one end, which I call the sharp end. It's on the ground, it's happening, and feedback. And I think it's really important that people do get timely feedback, particularly when it's in a stressful situation like this. So I'd welcome information on that, please, Chairman.
Thank you very much for that, Tina. Point well made, I think, and I share your frustration with my Shropshire in particular. Would anybody like to respond to Tina, please? Steve, can I come back to you again?
My apologies, my network was playing up there. Could you just repeat the question?
Sorry, Tina, could you speak again, please?
Yeah, it's just that obviously the customer service centre lost sight of the application grants in the processing. They didn't have sight of it. It says here there's methodologies developed as a result of COVID-19 will help to avoid this in the future. Obviously, I wanted to know what the methodology was, because obviously it's distressing times. The other thing is, the chairman just supported me. I have difficulties with my Shropshire and the sharp end. People want to know what's going on, and my Shropshire is part of that, and things it just falls, I'll be honest, into a black hole. So, you know, I just want to know the methodology of how we're improving things, because that's IT and communications again. So thank you, Steve.
So yeah, I mean, to be fair to the customer service centre, they're as good as the information available to them. And sort of going back to this grant came to the council quite unexpectedly, and what perhaps in hindsight we could have done was make sure that all that grant application information that was being managed by officers was shared with customer service centre, so that they had access to up-to-date information, where in what they were having to do was take a message, ask the flood manager to for the information, and then provide the information at a later date. And often, as you'll appreciate, the flood manager was difficult to get hold of because he was juggling so many balls at the time. So there were delays. So what we developed through COVID was a much more improved sort of document sharing area, where everyone who needed to had access to various documentation, and it's that sort of approach that we would see to support the customer service centre, not just during these sort of emergency situations, but more broadly as part of My Shropshire. And I know the chair referred to frustrations around that. We are looking at how can we better improve information available to the customer service centre to enable them to be more proactive.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. You're definitely having trouble with your connection, I'm afraid. Right.
Chair, if I might.
Yes, Daniel.
Sorry, Chair, if I might intervene. My apologies. You asked for some comment around rest centres, and you asked for some officers to comment on that. And I've noticed in the chat function, Kate Garner and Sherry Walgrove have both said they might be able to add something to that for you.
Yes, that would be helpful. Kate, could we start with you, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Kate Garner, Service Manager in Adult Social Care for Community Partnerships. I think I can see what Sherry has put some detail in the chat about emergency planning, reviewing and updating the rest centre. And I think that at the time, it may, with the benefit of hindsight, it may seem as if there was unnecessary energy and effort put into setting those up. But actually, I think that my experience was that there was actually a minimum of effort expended. And because they were being opened in tandem with those community reassurance people, officers being out and about, it could potentially have been really useful to have that place there. But, for example, the hall that was open in Bridge North, because the teams weren't quite sure what they were going to come across when they were, actually going to doors and knocking on doors and talking to people. So I think perhaps we make it sound as if the rest centres were very big, well staffed, and a lot of energy went in. But I think perhaps that they were quite simple spaces that could have responded and were in touch. I think the main thing was there was somebody there who was in touch with Shire Hall and with the Emergency Planning HQ. But I'm sure Sherry and Angela will take the learning from that.
Thank you very much for that, Kate. Sherry, would you like to come in?
Thanks for that, Kate. Yeah, they were small affairs, but again, as Kate said, we needed to open them just in case we did have residents come in needing assistance. We'll have to say that Ludlow actually opened up their own rest centre, and I have to take my hats off to Ludlow. We worked in tandem with them last year to update their emergency plan, and they put it to good use during the floods. So my hats off to the town clerk who opened up the rest centre there. So I do welcome the communities coming together and doing that, because that helps us out so much. We are a very, very small team. and having the assistance of the community down there in Ludlow to open up those centres was much appreciated.
Thank you, Sherry. And do you have a view of about reception centres rather than rest centres, or are you quite content with the term rest centre? It just seemed to me that a reception centre had rather more in it, rather more sort of advice available than perhaps a rest centre. Is that right?
Yes, and I think people responded to the name a bit better. And engaged with us, and we had all of the services plus the police liaising with us in the reception centre at Shire Hall. There is a time and a place for a rest centre, so we still need to have that in our back pocket. But I think going forward, we've learned that we can engage effectively with the public in a reception centre type environment. So that is the way that we are going to move forward and updating our plans accordingly. As I said in the feed, it's a smaller version of a humanitarian assistance centre, really. But a reception centre is something that the public engage with, and I think it's important for that name to be favourable to the public so that they will come to us and we can help them.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much for that, Sherry. That's very helpful. Viv, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, yes, it was a good idea to have the rest centre, but nobody knew about it. There were 2 people went, that's all. And I keep repeating this. I'm sorry. The people who needed the help were the people that were still in their houses, and they needed people on the ground. Yes, wonderful idea for a rest centre, but it hadn't been advertised. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Viv. Right. Do we have any more questions or comments from members? Any that I haven't picked up?
Have you picked up the one that I've just put in? The one about people who don't own their houses, but other people who do own them, they didn't get any money because the people who do own them have their second residence, but the people in the houses didn't get any money at all, and they lost everything. They lost all their electrical goods and everything. They had to move out completely. Now, if we could do something for them, a lot of people were very, very annoyed who were living in rented accommodation who didn't get anything from the council at all.
Okay, thank you for that, Viv. I don't know whether we have anybody who can comment on that, do we? Kate Garner, could you comment on that? Sorry, it may not be quite your area, but.
Hi, Chair. I think you'll need somebody from finance if you want me to.
Probably, and we don't have anybody from finance. Viv, I think what we'll have to do is I'll ask Daniel if he can pass your comments on, if that's all right.
Yes, that's very good. I only just remembered about that actually, okay. and I'm sorry, the 102-year-old who's been living in that property for 50 years, has been flooded many times, never receives any money whatsoever. She has to sort it all out. Her friends sort it out for her. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Viv. Tina.
Thank you, Chairman. I think it's the communications thing again as well. I mean, I listened to Radio Shropshire, and also there was the Twitter feeds. There were all the different feeds going on about, you know, where the centres were open, what was taking place. So I think from that point of view, actually, that coordinated quite well, in my opinion. So well done on that front for the communication. I think lessons were learned, and I think also with the COVID-19, the communications via some of the channels has been very, very good. So I think, you know, this report has given us lessons to move forward with, but it's just a thank you to all the teams really, and also the police and but I don't want to steal your thunder.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Tina, and thank you for your response. David Turner, just a quick final word.
Thank you, Chair. There's been lots of talk about providing accommodation and support to residents, and also thinking about highways and so on. Just one thing that's happened. It's a personal experience. One thing that happened, which you might wish to reflect upon, on the very rough night. I don't know whether it was Chiara or Dennis. I became aware that someone. I live on the Shropshire Way. I became aware of someone at the door who was looking for an opportunity to pitch his tent on my land. It was blowing a hoolie. What on earth he was doing walking from Cannock to Aberystwyth in weather like that, I do not know, but I rather suspect that he hadn't got access to the news and probably didn't realise the severity of the weather. And I don't know whether there's anything. In the end, I provided him with the opportunity to bunk down in an outbuilding, but I don't know if there's any opportunity to provide on walking routes or in centres where there is going to be some outdoor activity, some kind of signage or warning. I don't know whether this could ever have been prevented. It struck me as being foolhardy in the extreme, but I am a fairly soft individual. It doesn't require a response now, but maybe officers could just think about those who are holidaying, possibly outdoors pursuits. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps that could go into our tourism. That really, it's our tourism people, I think, who might need to maybe the outdoors partnership might be interested in that piece of information. Councillor Turner, thank you. Right, now, do I have anybody else who would like to speak on this report? I have no one else who is indicating. So, Steve, do you have any final words, or have you disappeared completely?
No, I'm still here. I'd just like to say thank you for the recognition of my teams and teams across the council in the hard work that they put in during this emergency. I think it's one of those where it really proves how good the councils can act in emergencies, and we get a lot of criticisms for certain areas. But I'm just pleased that there was so much recognition of the good work that the council did undertake at this stage.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. I would just like to comment before we move to the recommendations that it is always really difficult when you have something approaching a disaster suddenly striking you with very, very little notice to react and be effective. And I really do actually congratulate your teams and all the officers who got involved wholeheartedly and who worked so hard to see us through this. I think it was a great piece of work that you did, and I'm also very grateful to you for writing a report which actually enables some really sensible recommendations to come forward. I think that's very helpful all round. So if we look at the recommendations, that the council develop a severe weather plan to consolidate its preparation across all departments for future extreme weather events. I think that is absolutely essential, and I've no doubt it's well underway at the moment, and that included in this should be a plan to create a reserve officer capacity, also essential, so that we don't have awful lot of responsibility falling on too few shoulders, and that this should be deployed when an extreme weather event occurs. That Shropshire Council support the establishment of a wider grants team to deliver future grant funding to allow officers to focus on their substantive posts, and that Shropshire Council should fund the National Flood Forum to assist in community engagement and the creation of flood action groups across Shropshire to provide support for residents and businesses post-flood events. I'm going to put those recommendations to the committee. Do I have your support for those recommendations, please? I take silence as assent. Anybody not happy with them?
Nope.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. I note just before we leave this subject that we do have as an appendix the River Severn Partnership and Shropshire Flood Prevention. I believe this issue is particularly being taken up by the Place Overview Committee. But as far as the severe weather plan is concerned and the other recommendations, I think it would be very helpful to this committee if it could review with the officers how they're getting on a fairly regular basis, because this is a big piece of work that everybody has set themselves. And I think it would be very nice if you would be prepared to come back and keep us up to date with your planning for this. Right, thank you very much indeed for all the input into that. Now we move on to our work programme. Daniel?
Oh, Chair, can you hear me?
I can. Are you all right?
Okay, I've had a very flaky connection today, so I'm relying on tethering to my mobile phone. So do forgive me for poor quality and also for the lack of video for this. You should have a work programme report in your papers. You'll notice as well with each passing meeting, the report gets shorter and shorter. I'm not at the moment working to plan agendas for meetings after April, May 2021 on account of the local elections that are due, and don't want to sort of hand too many time bombs to your successors, and of course bearing in mind the successor might be yourself. So looking ahead to January and March, which are the only remaining meetings that we have on the calendar, there's just a single item at the moment scheduled for January. The Performance Management Scrutiny Committee has asked this committee whether it would look at the climate change draft action plan that's being created on the back of the Council's climate strategy, and also to take a deeper look at the quantified carbon budget within that. Obviously, that's the sole and the objective really of the strategy is to meet net zero with our carbon emissions. So if the committee is mindful to agree with that, I will make sure that comes to the meeting in January. I also know as well that you have a working group of the committee taking place this afternoon to look at the Council's housing allocations policy as agreed in your meeting, your previous meeting. So might I suggest that officers produce a report back to the committee on the work that the working group carries out in between this meeting and next. After that, you should have what looks like a fairly solid meeting for March, if perhaps a little too solid. We did want to look at the library strategy in January. The directors requested that we delay that until March. Because she's relatively new in post and feels that she will have something, a sense of direction that she can share with you at that point. The Chair and I have also met with officers concerning public transport and community transport funding, and they would like to bring an update on their work going forward in March. And finally, we have as an item to look at the draft rural strategy on the 15th of March meeting, and to recommend, I'll read out this, recommend a framework for engaging communities based on evidence of what works best and is best for Shropshire. And then that's that really up until the election period. I will leave it to the members to add, amend, remove from that as they see fit.
Thank you very much for that, Daniel. What does everybody think about the work programme for the next two meetings? Any comments?
Chair, I think Councillor Parry has asked whether we can look at rights of way in January. I know we looked at this last.
We had a session on that, didn't we?
Yeah. Can I just say, Celia, I'm getting a lot of complaints from the Shropshire side. Not the of course, they're right next to Hereford, and I'm getting a lot of complaints from Richards Castle in that area about rights of way and how they can't get through when they're going out walking. And also, we have an awful lot of people walking at the moment from Ludlow and different areas, and I'm getting complaints from them as well.
Okay, well, I think we could maybe, can we squeeze in an update on rights of way?
Well, we could do it, Chair. I think that might be quite useful as well, because certainly the last time we looked at this, the officers and the members sort of mentioned that there was considerable backlog of repairs on bridges and other structure that forms within the public rights of way. I think there was a report to council or cabinet on this earlier in the year, so it might be an appropriate time to sort of get an update on that from the officers.
Yes, I think that would.
Can I just say I've asked a lady to send me the photographs.
Okay.
Photographs of where she walks.
Okay. Thank you for that, Viv. I think that would go actually quite well in with the January meeting, don't you? Daniel?
Sorry, just busy taking notes while we're talking, so my apologies. Okay, I will add that in for the January meeting.
I think it's more appropriate for the January one. I think we're rather overloaded for March, because we've got some quite big ones for March.
I think somebody else, Tina's just asked around, Councillor Woodward has asked around which scrutiny would look at my Shropshire, and the answer to that would be the Performance Management Scrutiny Committee, and that is indeed coming under the banner of digital transformation to that committee next week. So Councillor Woodward, if you wanted to listen into that, I think that might raise some, will either answer your questions or raise some more for you.
I suspect that if you asked Tina, you'd be able to ask a question if you wish, if that's helpful to performance management. Thank you for that, Daniel. Is everybody happy with the work programme as it is now then?
Yes, happy, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Chair. Happy.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, Chair.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
That's good. Yes, and then we do tentatively have one for June, which is the local housing company. But we'll see how that goes, shall we?
Yes, Chair, sorry, I've forgotten around that. I've forgotten about that at the back of the page. But yeah, I think that's probably one for consideration when this committee reconvenes after the election.
Excellent. Okay. Right. I think that is the end of business for today. I would like to thank all our contributors very much, members of the committee for all their questions, Daniel, our committee officer, and Emily Marshall, who has stepped in to take the minutes. And many thanks, and we'll see you in January. And have a very good Christmas, all of you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you,
Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.